If the answer is yes, then how do we get past it?
In Iraq immediately, I think.
Well, no, not so much. No, I mean here now. How do we move past this issue here? No, well, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things we have to do is challenge some of the narrative about Iraq.
Right.
Okay. As I say, I opposed the intervention, but I don't think there's any evidence that it was a war for oil. If you look at what's actually happened and the ownership patterns, that just doesn't really stack up, that it was a war for oil. It wasn't a war against Muslims in any sense at all. It was a war to remove the Saddam regime, and what happened next was the removal of Saddam and his sons, the removal of the Ba'ath Party, the opening up of the mass graves, 400,000, the reflooding of the marshlands and the return of the marsh Arabs to their lands, the Shia reclaiming religious rights, which they've been repressed for many decades. So, and the enemy in Iraq, I don't think is a popular uprising of the Iraqi people to reclaim their national independence. That is also part of the narrative. That's a myth. We have Baathists who refuse to give up the power that the Sunni community had and are fighting to regain it. We have jihadists flooding in through borders which are unprotected and through Syria. We have Al-Qaeda. We have Shia militias fighting for control of the country in the south and so on. My point is that a lot of that was predictable, and it's criminal to the extent to which there was a lack of planning and a lack of foresight to take any of this into account. But the narrative you often get about Iraq is of arisen Iraqi people fighting an imperialist force. Now that I think is part of the Islamist assumption and the Islamist narrative, which, to the extent that we buy into it, we're really making a big mistake. I mean, we have to roll back from that and have a different kind of debate about what went wrong in Iraq and where we need to go from here.
Imran, to what extent is the war in Iraq, the decisions that were made, harming the case for the possibility of moderate Muslim groups in this country controlling the extremists, as you say, the small number of extremists within their communities?
Well, undeniably it has an effect, but for the wrong reason. You see, if I believe the government, we went into Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction and because of a despotic regime that was hurting its people. If I'm completely cynical, I might think that we actually went into Iraq to safeguard an oil supply because of how precariously our Western, in fact our global economy is balanced on a cheap and stable supply of oil. But it does not cross my mind, as someone who lives in the West and knows the West and understands the West, it doesn't cross my mind at all that it was in fact part of a concerted effort by the West to wage war on Islam. I mean, that's just completely nonsensical. I mean, if you wanted to wage war on Islam, Iraq would hardly be, secular Iraq, where they brew beer in state breweries, would hardly be the country you'd pick to go and wage war on Islam. But the very disturbing thing is that there are people out there who believe this to be the case. This is the fundamental argument of Al-Qaeda and of those other entities that support them and are allied with them and so on, that the West is waging war on Islam because the West hates Islam and so on. And if some people believe that, well, that is the education, as it were, the educational challenge, the perception challenge that we have to address. That's a real issue, that these people don't understand that the West is actually, if anything, motivated by economics, by security, and sometimes, very often, by humanitarian causes, but never by straight theology. Unfortunately, the people who believe this are basically falling into this very simple, polarized view, and which I call the tribal trap, that you, in any situation, you look for the party that you have a tribal affiliation with and take their side immediately. And I think that the way that that manifests in the Muslim community in this country, for example, is when some Muslims are inconvenienced in the early hours, are treated rather heavy-handedly and so on because of some information which we are not privy to, which the security services have received, and they need to be brought in and so on. Unfortunately, there are too many in the Muslim community who, rather than getting their sense of identity from the mainstream community and identifying with the mainstream community who are at risk from terrorist threats, or all of us are at risk from terrorist threats. Instead, because of some perceived shared ethnicity or religion, their instinct is to identify with the terrorist suspects because of that tribalism, and that's the fundamental mistake that they're making, that they need to actually identify themselves with the wider community and not with someone because of a common ethnicity or religion, if in fact those people are terrorist suspects. But that's a mistake that's being made. And there's just a very fundamental educational challenge here to prevent people from behaving in these very simplistic but deeply entrenched tribal terms, and actually understanding that these are complex issues, and that the West, again, there's no such thing as the West as a collective entity, but the West is generally motivated by security, economics, and humanitarian grounds, and rarely in simple theological terms.
I want to come back onto that question about identity at the moment. I think it's the key of both the tactical and the strategic response. But Louise, I mean, you talked about us being slow to realise the nature of the threat from terrorism. To what extent, I mean, it's the same question to you really, about the extent to which the war in Iraq is creating supporters for the threat that we face. And we're not going to be able to create stronger bonds of citizenship until in some way we can go past, we can achieve closure on the Iraq war.
Well, I certainly think it would be a grave mistake for anyone to start apologising for the action in Iraq, because I think that if that happened, despite the mistakes that certainly were made, I think that would encourage the jihadists, not just here, but around the world. And I think then start to push forward again this view that it's all about the war on Islam. And if we actually look at the reality and look at what a number of the individuals who have been not just arrested but found guilty on various charges of terrorism in this country, what those individuals actually talked about at their trials was not to do with Iraq being the motivator. And some of the things they did were planned long before Iraq. They talk about Chechnya, they talk about Kashmir, they talk about other areas. So an idea that somehow Iraq is the cause and the motivator of what's happening, and I think it's wrong. Some people might use that, but they actually quote other things as well as, or instead of. And I don't think there's any way that we should try to avoid facing up to the ideological nature of the threat that's there. And that's a threat based on concepts of who is an infidel and who isn't, a wish to destroy, and devaluing human life. And all of those things really are in sharp contrast to what we see as democratic values, and it's very hard for people to accept. But that is the reality, and I think it has to be accepted. And one of the impacts of what happened in Iraq is, I think, probably to make it more difficult in the short term at least to have military interventions, and over time, depending what happens there, it might be seen differently. But if I can pick up what Imran said, we do need to look at this a wider strategic view, and maybe if we look at things like supporting education in Pakistan so that young people don't have to go to the madrasas where they are taught to be terrorists, and can actually go to what we would recognise as educational facilities, schools, where they can learn to be citizens in other ways. So I think we have to look broader, but broader in that sense as well. But I don't think there's any way of avoiding responsibility for facing up to people who talk about wars on Islam. And I think here that idea is perpetuated by an alliance really of certain Islamic leaders, and it may not be many, but they are there. It's global, so it's to do with access to internet, messages people get from outside the country as well. And then people in the far left or in the left who find it convenient to work with that kind of view. And I think those are the things that have to be looked at as well.